So our first presenter will be Dr. Mark Kulp, and he's the chair of the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of New Orleans. He lived in New Orleans, now lives in Destrehan after the storm. He's a geologist, teaches a variety of courses on coastal dynamics, coastal geology. He's a Pennsylvania native, and he's a director of the Coastal Research Laboratory in the Pontchartrain Institute at UNO. He has a degree, Bachelor of Science degree in geology from Juniata College in Pennsylvania. He has a master's and a PhD in geology from the University of Kentucky. And he's going to talk to us today about progressive shifts and in the region and in the coastal region, and why we need to undertake projects, where we need to undertake projects, and how, as we weigh these options and what we're going to do as a population here in South Louisiana, that we still need to fundamentally recognize that this is a dynamic system that continues to change, and we need to pick our projects selectively and strategically. So please help me welcome Dr. Mark Kulp.
The title of the talk then is, what I'd like to do is just kind of address some of the geologic factors of managing what we call a transgressive system. That is, that the shoreline is progressively shifting in a landward direction. The Mississippi River Delta as a whole, it's been an icon of geologic studies for at least a century now, and has been a really important asset in terms of our ability to look at things like natural resource distributions around the globe, where oil and gas is stored within subsurface geologic units, coal resources, all sorts of different things. We've learned a lot about how the delta has grown through time, as shown here in this top diagram with the various colors. And we've also learned a lot about what happens to those parts of the delta that are later then abandoned and subjected to the forces of tides and waves. And one of the things that has come out of that research in the last couple decades is recognition that these advances of the delta are very ephemeral, and that soon thereafter the land built by the delta is overtaken and transformed into barrier shorelines. But those barrier shorelines, as shown in these lower diagrams, are also ephemeral. And if you essentially look from right to left on those lower diagrams, you see some of that indication in the fact that there's a Chandeleur Island system that's relatively intact, a Ile-de-Neer barrier island system in the center that's more or less broken up and has become fragmented through time, and then what we recognize as an old barrier shoreline sitting out on the continental shelf called Ship Shoal. And so it is in its very nature to change through time. One of the things that now has grown out of all these studies, and because of the situation we find ourselves in today, is that we're looking at a laboratory for geologic processes in coastal management, how to manage a shifting shoreline and the dynamics associated with those changes. So we have a new, what I would suggest is sort of a paradigm shift in terms of the utility of the Mississippi River Delta plain in terms of geologic sciences and importance to society and culture. And as many others have stated, this is certainly not the only place on the planet where these types of changes are taking place, but they're happening particularly rapidly here. And of course, in the United States, we have a lot of the resources to kind of address and deal with these situations. So it will be a model, I believe, and others have suggested, as I said, for other locations globally. Next slide. Well, you're all pretty aware that we have a pretty significant problem here in coastal Louisiana. If you take a look at all those diagrams that I have shown there, red means bad is the way what it amounts to. And the center diagram shows essentially suggested total land loss up until about 2050, published by the U.S. Geological Survey. And the two other diagrams, sort of partitioned to the lower left and lower right, show individual shoreline segments along the coastal zone. And you'll notice the extreme colors, hots and reds and so forth in each of these locations. The shift of the central coastline on the left-hand side around Port Fourchon has taken place, or has been about a total of about 3 kilometers since the late 1800s. So there's a long-term trend of change there. And if you look at, for example, on the right-hand side, the Chandeleur Island barrier system, you'll see that there's been a lot of land loss there as well in the central part of the system, and a lot of that took place very rapidly, particularly with the impact of Hurricane Katrina. So we have scales of change that are taking place, both longer term and very short term impacts because of storms. Next slide. The change that's taking place requires us to act very quickly, I think. There are some very fancy statistical studies of intensity of Atlantic tropical storms, hurricanes, which is where most of the storms that enter the Gulf of Mexico and become really problematic. They originate within the Atlantic basin, and these studies have shown that the maximum wind speed or the intensity of some of these hurricanes has increased through time, and it's shown by that upper blue line in the lower left-hand diagram. Okay, although the total number of storms is not necessarily statistically predictable or has been shown to take place, the intensity, there does seem to be an increase in the intensity. And then of course we have the rising sea level that everybody's aware of, and the predictions by IPCC that over the next century we may be looking at anywhere from about half a meter to a meter of sea level rise. So in a low-lying coastal plain such as ours, these two situations do not bode well for the future of this coastal zone. More recently, about 2 weeks ago I guess it was, there was a pretty profound paper that was published by Mike Bloom and Harry Roberts out of LSU that showed this map as a potential situation for the year 2100, projected future land loss of the coastal zone. And so in light of some of these projections, although some of the people have suggested that some of the results of this particular paper are contentious and they will be scrutinized heavily, it does, I think, provide a very good first glimpse at the severity of the situation that we're looking at, and that we may obviously be looking at very substantial changes along the coastal zone. Next slide, please. So here we are, we've got a culture, we've got an economy, ecosystems that are fundamentally important both locally, regionally, and nationally. And so how do we try to deal with these sorts of things? And from my perspective, and of course I'm biased as a geologist, but I think it's a very physical, science-based problem, very geologic in nature, that a lot of the things we're trying to address fundamentally require geologic investigation and considerations. So what are some of the possible solutions that have been presented? Well, a number of things are either currently underway or have been suggested, and they include, for example, the direct placement of dredged sediment, such as shown in the Timberlake Island figure up in the upper left-hand corner, actually rebuilding shorelines that have degraded through time. We have things such as the suggested freshwater diversions like the Davis Pond, which would help regulate salinity in ecosystems, but then also diversions as a means of land building when they're created correctly, constructed in the appropriate fashion. We've got things like marsh reconstruction that have been undertaken, such as down here at Fouchon by a joint effort between the Wisner Foundation and NOAA. And then, of course, in terms of protecting our local economy and culture, we're investigating and implementing the construction of major levee systems, not only an expansion of existing levee systems and a heightening or an increase of their elevation, but also then the construction of entirely new levee system around the southern Louisiana coast. So what's the feasibility of all these? And that's really what I'd like to address over the next few minutes, is take a couple of these and point out where there are pros and cons, and are we really sort of approaching all these efforts in the fashion that we should, and hopefully that will foster a lot of conversation. So take a look at freshwater diversion, the Carnarvon freshwater diversion being one of the most well-known. If you take a look at the wetland loss by marsh community within the area of the diversion, shown in the lower left-hand corner, what you see is that the total area lost after the 2005 hurricanes was largest within the fresh and intermediate marshes. Those marshes that are most closely are closest to where the diversional waters actually enter into the Carnarvon Basin, as shown in that lower left-hand corner. And the red within that lower map shows the amount of land loss within the basin, and there's a very good spatial correlation between the type of marsh and the land loss, okay? And so the question becomes, you know, fundamentally, why is that land loss in the upper part of the basin and restricted to the fresh and intermediate marshes?